Assalamu alaikum, good morning and good evening. We welcome all the participants from different parts of the world. We are now truly living in a global village. We also thank the organizers for this opportunity to connect with Professor Vali Nasr and get his views on some burning issues. Uh, so this is actually a conversation with Vali Nasr, and I'd just like to introduce Dr. Vali Nasr. He is a Majid Khadouri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and has served as Dean of the school from 2012 to 2019. Between 2009 and 2011, he served as the Senior Advisor to Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He is author of several books: The Dispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy in Retreat, The Shia Revival, and many others. He has written for the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and provided commentary on numerous media. So I could go on, but you all get the idea that Vali has a definitive insight of US and regional politics. So before I begin, Vali, in the regional politics, I've always been wondering, why did you choose to do your thesis on Jamaat-e-Islami and come to Lahore?
Well, assalamu alaikum. It's wonderful to be on this program, and it's very good to see you, Yawar Ali, and I thank the organizers for inviting me. When I was a graduate student, I was very interested in the relationship between Islam and politics. This was not long after the Iranian Revolution, and it was the tail end of the Zia period in Pakistan, and I found particularly the Pakistan case very interesting, largely because they had a long history of presence of Islamic parties in its politics. It was an open country in which you could look at the long-term trends that existed, and that fascination with how Islamic State, Islamic society, Islamic parties were negotiating politics in Pakistan brought me to Pakistan. And of course, Lahore was then the seat of Jamaat-e-Islami, which is the party that I thought was most important to look at. And I focused on that party, and I believe that Jamaat-e-Islami, along with the Muslim Brotherhood, is perhaps the most significant political forces that have shaped Islamic politics over the course of the past century. And that's where I ended up in politics, and my long association with Pakistan started.
So 1990 or 1991?
1989, actually.
89.
I came to Lahore.
Okay.
Yes.
Long time.
Long
So
time.
now let's get on to the subject. And the first question we have is that Pakistan has played a pivotal role in bringing all stakeholders of Afghanistan to the table. How shall Pakistan leverage this to rebuild the Pak-US relations?
Well, this is a very critical question for Pakistan, and I think for US-Pakistan relations. I think the sense that Pakistan is collaborating with the United States on Afghanistan and is actually helping the US is counterintuitive to the way in which many in the United States have thought about Pakistan's role. If you remember, going back decades, Pakistan was seen as a frenemy. There was a friend and an enemy at the same time. And during the Obama administration, which was the height of the recent escalation of American presence in Afghanistan, the United States thought that the Pakistani military intelligence services were supporting the Taliban. Pakistan was providing Taliban with safe haven, and that's why the United States could not defeat the Taliban. And that also the United States viewed that Pakistan was not helping any kind of a negotiated settlement. And this was also the view of the Afghan government throughout that period. But what we've seen is that in this new phase of United States engagement with the Taliban, Pakistan was actually the first and the main regional actor that supported the American initiative. It facilitated Taliban commanders, including Mullah Baradar, who had been in prison in Pakistan, to go to Doha, and Pakistan has been very supportive. So this actually presents Pakistan with two challenges. One is that, as you say, how does it build on this positive relationship with the United States? How does it turn the page? How does it tell the American people, the American Congress, and the American administration that they should look at Pakistan differently? But at the same time, Pakistan is facilitating America's departure from Afghanistan. And that does change America's priorities. In other words, it is not like you are trying to present a new image to America and build a new relationship in the old context when the United States still has a large security presence in Afghanistan, like the old days when the United States was mostly concerned with counterterrorism. And therefore, you would say it's the same amount of American effort and interest with a new kind of a Pakistan relationship. In a way, we're going to, if Pakistan is actually successful in getting the United States out of Afghanistan, then it would have to deal with the United States that is significantly more disinterested in the kinds of issues that Pakistan and the United States had either collaborated or clashed on. And that, I think, is a bigger challenge for Pakistan. So Pakistan can improve its relationship with the United States on the basis of its collaboration, but it cannot think that this will continue to be a security relationship. Pakistan has to really think about reinventing its relationship with the United States.
Okay, I think you just mentioned the next phase of Afghanistan, which is to stabilize Afghanistan, both for Pakistan as well as for the US, which means that their economic development is essential. So now with the International Development Finance Corporation, this new IDFC combination of USAID and OPIC is willing to assist US business. Is there a plan to rebuild the Afghan economy, or is there thinking going on about it in the US? And there are some very essential sectors like construction, food, Coca-Cola is already in Afghanistan, and health, in which some of the Pakistani doctors who are in the US as diaspora, they could also take a lead in that. So what is your view on this?
Well, I think at least in the short to medium run, the United States will continue to provide Afghanistan with some degree of economic support in order to stabilize the country and to build it. The long run, I don't know. American foreign policy priorities may shift to other parts of the world, and also the economic situation, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, does not necessarily support continued generous investment in foreign aid. But for I think in the short term period, there's going to be an economic dividend to Afghanistan. And Pakistan is well placed to do that. It borders on Afghanistan. The other big neighbor of Afghanistan, Iran, cannot be recipients or participants in foreign aid because of the sanctions issue. China has its own agenda, and Pakistan and China can also collaborate on varieties of projects in Afghanistan. But Pakistan does have certain advantages in order to collaborate on economic projects. But I do think that requires of Pakistan some proactive measures, namely, it actually has to work on improving its relations, that's at the government level, with the government of Afghanistan. I mean, in Afghanistan, there is still a hangover view of the period where the United States was Pakistan was seen as a supporter of the Taliban. Relations between Kabul and Islamabad have not always been very warm. And ultimately, economic presence by Pakistan in Afghanistan does require improving those relationships. There has to be a better Kabul-Islamabad relationship for business to work. It also requires that Pakistan does make investments in Afghanistan, investments in that would ultimately pay Pakistan back. It has to be investments in trade, investments in infrastructure. There has to be investments in public relations between the two countries. And some of these also can come directly from Pakistani businesses that are going to be making money in Afghanistan. In other words, if one is going to do construction projects, it does require investing in certain things in Afghanistan, for infrastructure that would support that. But I also think it's to Pakistan's own good to have an economic relationship with Afghanistan. In a post-security environment, Pakistan as a large country in this region cannot allow China, India, Iran to have economic relationships with Afghanistan, and its only issues with Afghanistan to be political and security. That will not be the basis for a better future for the region or for Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Okay, thank you. I think one of the foreign ambassadors told me that there are 40 billionaires in Afghanistan. So it's a good place to do business with them. You're right. Now, given Pakistan's current engagement with China, and now the intense competition and trade war between China and the US, will countries in South Asia and West Asia be asked, are you with us or are you against us? Now, also given the bipartisan agreement between the Republican and the Democratic parties on China and the containment of China policy, will it also lead to a new Cold War?
Well, that's the big question in Washington these days. Where is the competition and rivalry and antagonism with China going? There's no question that we're moving from a perception of cooperation and coexistence with China with something that is going to be much more conflictual. But how far it goes is actually not known, partly because unlike with the Soviet Union, there is a lot of economic interdependence between China and the US. And there is talk of decoupling, but that's more talk than a reality. But there is no question that as relations between China and the United States become more antagonistic, many countries are going to feel pressure from both sides, not just from the United States, but also from China. And Pakistan is not alone. If you look at Southeast Asian countries, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, they are also feeling the pressure. They're feeling pressure from Beijing on certain things, and they're also feeling pressure from the United States. And it's basically presenting these countries with some significant, if you were to say, diplomatic challenges. How do you navigate not getting caught between the massive neighbor to your north or to your east and the big superpower that has a dominant position over global economy, and that you need to collaborate with it. So I think, the CPAC is a fact in Pakistan. America's not happy with it. America's not going to compete for CPAC. It's not going to invest $60 billion in Pakistan. But if Pakistan wants to avoid being caught in a, are you with us or are you against us, it has to build economic relations with the United States. It has to find ways to create relations. As I mentioned, the security relationship is going to be getting less and less as the United States is not only leaving Afghanistan, more than likely is leaving the Middle East as well. And its interest in this region of the world is getting less. But Pakistani businesses, Pakistani civil society, Pakistani government have to find ways to make themselves economically relevant to the United States and to help create a footprint economically for the United States inside Pakistan. That helps create certain balance. It allows you to be able to make the argument that Pakistan is not in its entirety an economic client of China, that it has relations. And also similarly, build relations with the European Union. These relations will not be as large or as big as the one that Pakistan has built with China, but having them would be significant in helping Pakistan navigate the diplomatic terrain.
You're right. Pakistan's biggest trading partner today is the US. So if we continue on to the China side, the standoff between India and China where both are claiming the other side is changing the status quo. The US policy of containment of China, how far will the US go to support India?
Well, it depends on how far this border conflict goes. I mean, the United States has for a very long time thought that India would be a Asian counterbalance to China. The Japanese and the Australians have also looked at India as a counterbalance to China. But in reality, this has for now been more theory than practice. India's ability to play a much bigger economic role in Asia has not happened. Indian economy grew, but now it's actually shrinking post-pandemic. And as much as India's economy has grown, India is not a big investor in Indonesia or a big investor in Philippines or Malaysia. It has not. It itself is looking for investment. It does not play the same economic role that China plays. India is also not a major customer, let's say, for Australia or Korea or Japan's products or commodities, the way in which China is. So it's right now, it's not there yet. It has to grow economically much more in order to counterbalance China as another another Asian giant. So that leaves the issue of military. So will the Indians invest a lot more in their military capabilities in order to balance China? I think the border clash is likely to prompt India to invest a lot more in its military capabilities in order to deter what they're seeing now as a more aggressive face of China on their borderlands. And the United States likely to support that. I mean, if it's a question of creating military balance against China, I think you might see that much more likely to happen. So this border clash is significant. It's small, but in terms of where it might lead both China and India, I think it's fairly significant.
But increasing the military capability would certainly suit the US military industrial empire very much. Okay, now we move from China, has taken the first step towards Iran-China cooperation. How will the US and India react to this new development?
Well, India in particular is very worried about the China-Iran angle, largely because it has direct implications for India. If Iran were to become, let's say, if Iran was to sign something similar to CPEC with China, and as part of that, China finds a much greater role in Iran's economy, and India is not capable, because of US sanctions, to retain its position in the port of Chabahar, and would have to wash its hands of the investments it's made in Chabahar in building a road from Iran's port on the Gulf of Oman into Afghanistan. Then China, already being in Gwadar, already being in Pakistan, and then being in Iran, would end up dominating completely the access ways to Afghanistan and Central Asia. And that is a strategic loss for India. India has invested in that access way, has invested in going around Pakistan in order to have its own connection with Afghanistan and Central Asia. So a Chinese presence in Iran at a time that China is also antagonistic with India is strategically not good for India. The United States is more sort of, I think, looking at both China and Iran as hostile or adversarial countries that are now coming together. But the United States is not looking at this with the kind of strategic urgency that India might, particularly because the United States is actually giving up its position in Afghanistan. It's actually, when the United States thinks about China, it only thinks about the Pacific as East Asia. in American imagination, they don't think of China as a West Asian power, the way that Iranians or Pakistanis or Indians do, which neighbor on India. They think that, you know, everything to do with China, military deployment, economics, everything has to do with East Asia. So I think but what we're seeing is that China is gradually becoming more and more interested in West Asia. And by West Asia, I mean everything from Central Asia, the Middle East to South Asia, the entire corridor that goes from Kazakhstan to the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
You mentioned about the South Asia and East Asia. What policy shift do you anticipate if in South and West Asia region, if the new administration takes over, and what will be the signals to watch out for?
Well, I think the new administration is not going to be making a major sort of a pivot. I think there are certain continuities. One is that the antagonism with China could take new directions, could become less hostile, let's say, under a Biden administration. But nevertheless, the competition with China is now the focal point of American foreign policy. That's not going to change. And the US military, US economy, US diplomacy is very focused on China issues. And as I said, they see this largely as an East Asia issue. I think the withdrawal from the Middle East and the withdrawal from Afghanistan will continue. I don't see a new American president eagerly saying that I'm going to reverse the Doha talks and we're going to go back to a presence in Afghanistan. Or I don't think that a new administration would want to deploy large numbers of US troops to the Persian Gulf and to the Middle East. In fact, the Biden the Biden campaign is talking about reducing tensions with Iran, going back to the nuclear deal, using more diplomacy and less military in dealing with Middle East sets of issues. The second factor is that the American economy is doing better than many economies around the world, but it's also it has been battered by the pandemic. The number of jobless people, the decline in rate of growth, those are all there. And that does impact the capacity and will of the United States to engage in a lot more foreign security military adventure. And the third is that American politics is now, an American system is deeply, deeply divided. And there's going to be an enormous amount of internal focus for the new administration. It's not like other administrations we've seen where things are good at home and you come in with a big focus internationally, or that you see international things as a solution for your domestic problems. So that the race issues in America, the divide between the right and the left in America, the antagonism between Republicans and Democrats, these are now facts of American politics, which means that only a few foreign policy issues are going to capture even the attention of the American public. And in this, what we've seen in the past 2 years is that counterterrorism, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the sort of post 9/11 sets of issues are no longer even in the first 10 pages of a newspaper, if at all. And you know, politics and politicians respond to where public opinion is, and public opinion is not focused on these things. So I don't think that we're going to see a shift back to the region. But on the other hand, I think the Biden administration would be open to ways in which Pakistan-US relations can help the United States, in fact, address its own issues, leave the region. They would be open to engagement on economic sets of issues. But I have to say that, you know, Pakistan cannot, you know, continue to have conversation about export of manufacturing and textiles to the US. In the current economic environment in the United States, that's a non-starter. Pakistan has to think about, you know, the tech sector, has to think about healthcare sector, has to think about climate sector, has to think about other areas of economic investment and economic growth. and building relationships that actually would get immediate American support rather than resistance by the traditional groups in America that resists, let's say, export of textiles to the U.S.
You're right. We have to fit into whatever is now current in the American radar, so we can get some.
That's right. That's right.
So now we move on to something very current. Israel, UAE, and Bahrain signed a historic peace deal at the White House on Tuesday. With Jordan and Egypt, it now makes 4 Arab countries signing peace agreements with Israel. That night, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed at the White House ceremony, and he said, President Trump is lining up some more countries. Do you see Saudi Arabia joining these Arab countries? And Pakistan is with the Saudi camp and has stood steadfast with the Palestinians from 1947 till today. I'd like your comments on
that. I think Saudi Arabia eventually will join. I do not think that Bahrain would have joined this peace deal had it not been without Saudi approval. Bahrain is very close in terms of its foreign policy with Saudi Arabia. I think the challenge for Pakistan is that well, let me backtrack. So we could say that this deal has a lot to do with United States leaving the Middle East, with the growing worry in Persian Gulf monarchies about Iran and also about Turkey, and that in the past decade during the Arab Spring, civil wars in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Libya, that the main strategic issues for the Gulf countries is not Palestinian issue. It's now their own defense, their own strategy, and that they share a lot of common positions with Israel, and these now have been built into a much more of a strategic relationship with Israel, which has resulted in normalization of relations. But there's something else also happening here, which is I think there's a generational change in the leadership in the Persian Gulf, particularly under the new crown prince in Saudi Arabia, that they are no longer beholden to what I would call an Islamic foreign policy. And that they also are seeing the priorities for their countries very differently. So in both Saudi Arabia and UAE, they're no longer putting Palestinian issue is one issue, but the more important issue for them is Iran and is now Turkey. They have ambitions of leading the Arab world, and in that they need American support. And to get the American support, they see it important to have good relations with Israel. And also, they're now looking at India as a far more important trading partner than they see Pakistan. I mean, the latest spat between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia was not over Israel, was over India, and was over Kashmir. And this is likely to continue. So, I mean, Pakistan will have strong economic relationship with Saudi Arabia and UAE. But I think the challenge for Pakistan is that it's entering an era where the Persian Gulf countries no longer are driven by, as I said, a sort of Islamic solidarity and Islamic foreign policy. So the normalization of relations with Israel is a secular decision. It's a realpolitik decision. It's like the enemy of your enemy is your friend. They see Iran as the enemy, and they see Israel, therefore, is their friend. And they're also building relationships with India. And I think that poses some serious questions for Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan may find itself getting closer to Turkey and Iran, or I mean, you know, in other words, it has to sort of rethink in terms of where does it fit in this new world order that we're seeing between Persian Gulf and Israel.
Yeah, I think you're right. We're in the age of geoeconomics now, and that is what is driving most countries. So my last question is a $64 billion question, and I'm not going to ask you who's going to win the November 3rd election. But what we would like to know is what are the key issues that can swing the U.S. election one way or the other?
Well, in reality, nobody really knows who's going to win. I mean, there are polls out there, but the polls proved wrong last time in 2016. And the polls may not tell us exactly who's going to vote on that day and for whom. Secondly, much like 2016, it's going to be a handful of states that are going to decide this election. It's Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Arizona, and maybe a few others that are going to be toss-up states. And it's not clear who will win. And then secondly, we're in a very unique era in America that the country is so divided politically. We are not, for the first time, seeing that yes, economic issues matter, but for large numbers of voters, they are not going to be voting on the economic issues that are identity issues, political issues that are perhaps going to be driving the vote. We're seeing, areas of the country that are not doing well economically and may have not benefited during the Trump administration, and yet are still very staunchly pro-Trump. So we still don't know how this is going to play out. But one other thing that is very important is that we may not know the winner on November 4th for the first time, because such a large number of the population are likely to be voting by mail, that the results that on the morning after or late night on November 3rd might be reflected, may change as more and more of the vote is counted. And we're currently seeing that the Democrats are encouraging mail-in ballots for varieties of reasons, and the Republicans are discouraging it. So more Republicans may vote on the day, and therefore that night President Trump may say, well, look, I won, but the mail-in ballot may take up to a month to count, and the results may change.
And what is the expectation of the percentage of postal ballots that will come? Is it 10, 20% or?
No, it could be more. It depends on states, but it could be actually more. And there are some estimations that by end of September, half the voters would have voted already, which is there's large numbers of people who are asking for absentee ballots. Whether they actually mail it in, when do they mail it in, we don't know. But this is the first time that mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, are going to be a large part of the vote.
And they can only be opened after November 3rd? Is that?
I believe so. And every state has its own rules, but this is one of the issues that actually ended up in litigation and before Congress as to whether a ballot has to be received by the day of the election or has to be postmarked by the day of the election.
Okay.
And Republicans didn't want to allow people to have it postmarked by even the day. Because they believe that most Democrats are likely to, because they observe the pandemic, they don't, they may actually end up voting by mail.
Okay, well, if we may go on further, we have a few questions, and you mentioned Turkey. So one of the first question is, how do you see Turkey's emergence as a leader of the Sunni Muslim world? Has Saudi Arabia abdicated its claim as a leader of the Ummah? And this is from Mr. Hassan Bukhari from Islamabad.
That's a big battle within the Sunni world, and it's been going on for some time. It is very clear that, as a lot of Arabs would say, that President Erdogan is posing essentially as a latter-day Ottoman Sultan, and asserting a Turkish leadership in the Sunni world. This was very clear during the Arab Spring, and it's something that the Saudis and UAE have rejected and do not support. But I wouldn't say Saudi Arabia has abdicated that the fact that it's claimed to be the leader of the Sunni world. The king in Saudi Arabia is still Khadim al-Haramain, the protector of the two holy sites. But I would say that what we've been seeing in the past decade at least, and particularly since Mohammed bin Salman has taken the helm in Saudi Arabia, is that Saudi foreign policy is becoming more secular, more driven by geoeconomic and geopolitical issues rather than Islamic issues, whereas the Turkish foreign policy, or let's say Middle East policy, is becoming more Islamic. Turkey is playing the Islamic card more. Saudi Arabia seems to be responding to it less. But the rivalry between them about who speaks for Islam, for the Sunni world at least, is pretty intense.
Okay, we're still on the Saudi and Middle East side. Mr. Asad Shah is asking, is there any threat to the Arab monarchies in this process of major shift towards friendship with Israel? Or are the populations docile or fearful to raise any protest?
I would say, first of all, in countries like UAE or Qatar, the size of the local population is fairly small, and political dissent can be contained. But I would also say that there has been a sea change in the Arab world. Arabs care deeply about the Palestinian issue, and most Arabs are not reconciled to peace deals that basically sideline the Palestinians. But the key question is the Palestinian issue important enough for them to go to the streets or to undermine their own governments? And the evidence for that is not there. When the United States moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, there was no backlash. Saudis or UAE have been hinting of good relations with Israel for some time. It's been an open secret that there's intelligence, military cooperation. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, when he first visited Washington, said that the Jews have a right to their own state. And none of these basically created demonstrations in the Arab world, brought people out. And the sense is that in the Arab world, that what really is driving things is civil wars, is catastrophes. Look at Lebanon. It's the explosion, it's lack of food, it's a lack of governance in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya. And so I think, there is no question that the Palestinian issue at this moment in time, as important as it is, as much as the Arab have opinion on it, it's not the prime driving force in the region. And I think the Arab monarchies have made the calculation that, yes, their populations may not approve, but they can ride this without a serious challenge to their stability.
Now, Vali, this is an interesting question from our friend Shashi Tharoor. Mm-hmm. He is actually a master of the English language.
Of course.
So his question is, he advocates that constrainment of China and not containment of China. And he asks you, what do you think? Constrainment versus containment?
I think it's a very, very interesting nuance, and I very much encourage Shashi to articulate this for foreign policy discussion. I think often when people think about China in the United States, they think in terms of a Cold War paradigm. And that is really not applicable, because with the Soviet Union, there was no economic interrelationship, and there was a very clear ideological divide. And as much as, let's say, Secretary Pompeo wants to use the word Communist Party in China, it really doesn't stick, because you're not having an ideological confrontation with China. The Chinese are not trying to change the the political economic system of the rest of the world. And the United States is still hugely interdependent with China for manufacturing, exports, imports, and the like. And the Cold War language does not fit. But I would say at the same time, one of the underlying issues for a lot of Americans is two things. One is that China doesn't play fair. And so somehow you have to get it to be more fair. But the second one is that maybe there is a small time frame left to prevent China from achieving actual domination. And that, I think the term constraint, if I understand Shashi correct, would apply. In other words, how would the United States manage not to contain China, as he says, but actually to prevent it from becoming dominant? And that does not mean decoupling from it. It does not mean going to war with it. It does not mean isolating it. It means slowing its rate of economic growth and preventing it from using the system, international system, in a lopsided way in order to basically get global dominance.
Okay, there is another question from Mr. Syed. What is the role of Russia in the Middle East and South Asia? How is the US going to react to its increasing role in this region?
Well, Russia's role has been actually growing in the region much more aggressively in the past decade and a half, 2 decades, than has that of China. Russia does not have a big economic role. Yes, it might sell some things to different countries in the region. And yes, it has a very big role in oil prices, and it has worked with Saudi Arabia periodically and OPEC to sustain oil prices. But its main presence in the region is military. It got involved in Syria. It's now getting itself involved in Libya. It has had a security relationship with Iran. It is talking about selling weapons to countries around the region, including Iraq. And it also, in collaboration with Iran, has got itself involved in Afghanistan, both on the security side, as we had even reports in the US that it has built relations with the Taliban and was encouraging the Taliban to kill American soldiers. But also it hosted at least the first round of peace talks in Moscow. Now, the Trump administration basically does not want to focus on Russia. It has focused much more on China. But I think one difference with the Biden administration is that the Biden administration is going to be much more focused also on Russia. But I also think that Russia's relationship in the region is not economic, it's security oriented, that it will continue. Because the Middle East and South Asia are extremely divided, and that always leaves room for Russian interference. And I would also say that Russia has built at least in the Middle East, a tremendous infrastructure by creating some kind of a strategic relationship with both Turkey and Iran. There is an axis there, if you would, that in Syria or in other contexts could play an important role.
There's another question from Mr. Ali. What will be the demographic impact of young people on the Middle East and South Asia and their approach towards the US? I imagine it's talking about how the young will feel in the Middle East, if I understand.
Well, what we're seeing in the Middle East is that the young is increasingly not interested in the old foreign policy issues. If we look at protests in Iran or the Arab Spring or recent protests in Lebanon or Iraq, what we are seeing is that the young are driven by demand for jobs, by economic issues. That yes, some of them do go into extremism out of frustration, but in reality, They no longer see, the Palestinian issue as a solution for the fact that, southern Iraq in 110-degree heat could have 11 hours of no electricity, or that there are no jobs in Lebanon, or that the government is bankrupt, or that in Iran, Iranian foreign policy, justified, not justified, has had them. It is the young people in Iran who are paying for Iran's resistance to the United States. And ultimately, I think the next generation is looking for solutions, and they're not seeing solutions in the old government approaches. And I think for many countries in the region, that is dangerous, because you're now having a generation that is demanding change, and the economic pressure is growing, and the old politics is not going to bring economic dividend. And if you have populations like also in Pakistan, 65%, 70% of the population is young, you have to see where are jobs going to come from. And they're not going to come from confrontation with India or war in Afghanistan or confrontation with America. There has to be a solution.
Coming back to Iran, the question is, does the EU have any role in the Middle East after the Iran deal failure? Because what will be the reaction in the EU, and what can they do?
Well, the way that the Trump administration left the European Union, left the nuclear deal, and then put pressure on the European Union not to do business with Iran either, has definitely undermined Europe's credibility in the region. And then when it comes to Washington's relationship with Riyadh, with Abu Dhabi, with Doha, and with the Israeli government, it's very clear that Europe has no role to play. So in other words, there's a sort of a tight relationship between America, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, and Egypt, Bahrain, that basically does not include Europe. I think going forward, the Europeans still have important economic and diplomatic role to play. Largely, that I think that the way the United States has approached America first is not going to work. And especially under new administration, they will find out that they do need Europe. They do need another partner there, even if it's a junior partner. They need it. And then whether in the Middle East or in the case of Pakistan, Europe is not as big an economy as America or as China, but it's still a pretty big economy. And having relations with it ultimately will matter to the economic growth of these countries.
Now, there's another question which is somewhat interesting. About a year ago at the UN last year, about the same time, there was a meeting held between Turkey, Pakistan, and Malaysia. Mm-hmm. So the question actually is, will a newer Muslim bloc emerge with Turkey, Pakistan, and Malaysia? Is there any substance to it, or how do you think about it?
Well, you have to say, I think the meetings are substantive. I think the objectives are substantive, but I don't see how it's going to solve the immediate geostrategic sets of issues that all of the Muslim countries are facing. I think all countries try to build new alliances, whether along the lines of culture, economics, or political interest. It does help them, but it helps them marginally. But for fundamental things like Turkey's confrontation with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE in Libya, or Turkey's issues in the Middle East, I don't see how Pakistan or Malaysia can help it in a substantive way. Or for Malaysia, the issues are not Middle Eastern at all. Malaysia's largest issues is how to navigate the terrain between China and the United States. And in that context, I don't think Turkey or Pakistan can actually really play an important role. As I mentioned earlier, I think what we see already in this normalization of relations between UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, that countries are beginning to think much more in terms of hardcore geopolitical and geoeconomic interests. And yes, there's going to be interest in Islamic Brotherhood, but it's not going to replace, for Turkey, alliance with Iran and Russia matters a lot more to what Turkey needs to do in the Middle East than alliance with Malaysia and Pakistan.
Okay, I think Mr. Asim is very keen to find out which side do you think Pakistan will take about recognizing Israel. Can Pakistan leverage recognition of Israel to the solution of Kashmir dispute?
Kashmir dispute is so huge that I think nothing can quite leverage its solution. But let's say, yes, of course, a recognition of Israel can leverage many things for Pakistan. It can, but that's a decision Pakistan has to make, and I think it's much more largely dependent on public opinion in Pakistan, and how do decision makers in Pakistan look at Pakistan's national interest. What do you get from a recognition, and what do you get from not having that recognition? The only thing I could say is that the land on which Pakistan stood has shifted. Right.
Well, I was talking to Mr. Khurshid Kasuri the other day, who did have a meeting in Turkey with his counterpart from Israel. And he said, what will we get in return? And the answer was that we can give you all kinds of technology, especially agriculture, which can benefit Pakistan. Water technologies, there are about 12, I think, joint ventures with India on different water technologies. So, of course, also the fact that the two climates are similar between Middle East and Pakistan. So the hot climate has a very big role to play in the agriculture and livestock side.
Well, and also there is an American side to it. I mean, even if you looked at this current deal, yes, there are things that Israel can give in terms of technology and investment, et cetera, to UAE and vice versa. But UAE wanted F-35 jet fighters, and also it wants the U.S. Congress and U.S. public to be much more favorable towards the UAE. Let's not forget that when President Sadat recognized Israel, there was a massive multi-billion-dollar dividend on an annual basis to Egypt that sustained Egyptian economy for a very, very long time. And Egypt's image in the United States changed. So recognition of Israel is not just about bilateral relations between the two countries. It's really about managing the United States.
Okay, there is another question from Mr. Asad Shah. This is coming back to the tensions between US and China. Is there still scope for a win-win situation in relations between these two countries rather than a more aggressive approach of US in a Cold War style to try to contain China? What would be the impact of these emerging relations on peace in Afghanistan?
On Afghanistan, I don't think much. Afghanistan is not important enough to be a deciding factor in US-China relations. And America's interest in Afghanistan is not economic, it's not geographic. America does not border on Afghanistan like China does. Its interest in Afghanistan was very pure and simple. It was security. It didn't want an attack coming to the United States from Afghanistan. And now that it has basically come to the bare bottoms of just securing that, it can basically wash its hands of Afghanistan. United States and China can have a better, let's say, management of the relations, but I don't think this idea that they can cooperatively move forward is not going to work. Look, the reality of it is that China is becoming a superpower in every sense of the term. It wants to become a superpower. It is not logical that the existing superpowers would welcome that. Who would welcome someone else becoming equally or more powerful than them? And at the same time, also, I think the Chinese, once they become a superpower, they're not going to be a tolerant and cooperative power either. If you look at how they're handling South China Sea, it does not give a sense of a benign country that just wants to get along and make money. It's likely to also behave in imperial fashion. And so some of the conflict, it goes back as long as history does. This is no different from England, Germany conflict on the eve of World War I, or many other conflicts through history when a rising power was resisted by the existing power, and once things shifted, then the shoe was on the other foot. Geopolitics is a reality of the world order. We can manage it better, but we cannot deny it.
Okay. I think there's just one or two questions left. I think you have to look at your crystal ball and predict which other Arab countries will recognize Israel. That's the question.
Well, very immediately, maybe none, but maybe after the elections, I think, Sudan is in line, Saudi Arabia, I would say Qatar, and eventually Oman. I think, gradually we're going to see a trend in that direction. Right now we're going to have a period where this normalization will be socialized, if you would, in the Arab world. But I think the Arab world now as a whole, and I don't want to mean every single of the 22 countries, but the most important countries in the Arab world now look at Iran and Turkey as the main rivals in the region. And they see Israel as a necessary strategic balancer. And also, as the United States is leading the Middle East, they would look at Israel as the way in which they can keep the United States on their side.
Which was about
Sure.
How will the shift from a focus on Islamic Brotherhood to geopolitics, what effect would it have on sectarian divides in the Muslim world?
Well, to some extent, I think sectarian divides are going to be there because there are instruments of realpolitik. I mean, Iran is Shia, Saudi Arabia is Sunni. They do benefit from emphasizing this because it defines who's with them and who's against them. But this is not sectarianism driving, if you would, political rivalry. It's rather rivalry between two regional powers trying to mobilize every asset or equity they have in the region in order to combat the other one. So the Iranians would emphasize Shia brotherhood with Iraqi Shias because that will limit Saudi influence there. The Bahraini government would emphasize Sunniness because it connects it with Saudi Arabia much more. And so this is not going to go away. But I think, Islam is not going to go away. But I think the way we have to think about this is that countries in the Middle East are no different from countries elsewhere in the world. In other words, what's driving their foreign policy is hard geopolitical, geoeconomic facts. They're after national interests. And Islam is an important part of that conversation. But in reality, the Middle East is in a phase which is like Europe of the medieval period, with rising and falling powers, fighting over turf, fighting over influence. So if you listen to Saudi UAE language, they're complaining about Iran acting like an imperial power taking over Arab lands. Or Turkey, breaking the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire and reappearing in Syria, in Lebanon, in Libya. This is not about Islamic rivalry. This is about geopolitical rivalry.
I think, Yaqub, if we have any other questions, we can take them up, or so we thank Vali for his time and all the enlightenment he's given us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This has been a fascinating conversation. I very much enjoyed it, and I hope to be with you again.
Inshallah. Thank you, Vali. All the best.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Allah Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz.